before we get into folks that are outside the Resolve building so you can see some real world experience in making these decisions. Earlier in my career, I got the opportunity to talk to an executive at Netflix because at that time they were releasing so many open source projects. And I was like, well, how do you decide on this build versus buy or when you're going to allocate engineers' times to creating something and then open sourcing it? And their response was like, of course, them being heavy on AWS, I would imagine they're the ones that helped coin the undifferentiated heavy lifting. But for them, it was more around, is this a problem that one is critical to our business functioning, but two, that nobody else has actually solved yet? And if so, the decision is already made. And so now I want to talk to Divya as well as Kent to understand how they're making these decisions in their organizations. And so first off, this build versus buy debate. When you're looking at, say, making a technology decision or allocating like, engineering resources or headcount, how do you decide on build versus buy? And Divya, maybe you want to start.
Thank you, Josh. Let me give some context about my team. I'm Director of Engineering at ThoughtSpot. ThoughtSpot offers AI for BI, and my teams build the Mode as a data warehouse, and we joined ThoughtSpot through an acquisition of Mode Analytics. And we build Mode as a data warehouse for ThoughtSpot AI and analytics. In the last 3 years, we have tripled the backend footprint of our services from 4 to 12 homegrown production grade services. And in terms of evaluating whether we use open source or third party or build versus buy, the usual suspects. So what is the desired functionality? What is the cost of ownership? Will this grow with the roadmap of the company? And we move really fast, so innovation and pace is very important, whether we consider a third party or an open source tool.
And Kent, do you want to add anything to how you think about the principles and maybe give an intro as well?
Yeah, sure, Josh. So I currently lead the core consumer experience at Yelp. And prior to that, I spent about 10 years building developer productivity tools internally at Yelp. So I kind of have two different points of view on this. And I think the interesting thing is like early on, we didn't have a lot of tools in the developer productivity space. So I think similar to what you said before, Josh, if the tool isn't really out there, then we're going to end up building it if we need to solve a problem within our company. The interesting thing today is there's a proliferation of tools in the space. And then also as I move into the consumer space, I may not want to get into building out some of the things that are maybe more internal operations for the business. I might be wanting to focus on building towards our external consumer product. And so I think a lot of kind of what you all have said already resonates in that space. Like, you know, am I building out my core competency, or am I, or is this something that, you know, I'm okay to defer?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I actually want to double click on that. Divya, one of the things you said is you've tackled a lot of these projects, and it seems like you have a pretty strong principled way of approaching it. Usually when I think of build versus buy, I also think of like speed, performance, customization. Like, are there any learnings, maybe good learnings and bad, similar to how Gabor explained some of the mistakes that they made or the learnings as well that you can share in terms of your experience in some of these more recent projects?
Absolutely. Um, so I'll actually share an experience of a case where building worked for us, and it actually brought unexpected benefits. We were using a third-party, pretty popular managed service for powering the schema browser for SQL queries. And as we added more customers and added AI capabilities, we started hitting hard limits. And the only way out was throwing more money at it. And this was already the third most expensive tool in our portfolio. So we decided to build in-house. So we shipped a service in 6 months. at 1/10 the cost, at 8x faster response times. And the scale was pretty high. The largest data source index was around 150 million columns. So the ROI was pretty high in building in this case.
Yeah.
But to do the same as an agentic solution for platform services poses new challenges, and I'm watching this space very closely.
Yeah. It is fascinating. I think that that's a great segue into like the differences in the equation. So Mayank mentioned the velocity in which AI is evolving. I was talking to, so in our product, we now when we root cause something, we can actually go and call Cursor to produce a PR. Which if you would have asked me 6 months ago, if we were going to get that, I would have thought it would have taken 2 years. Like, yes, of course, that's what we all want, but is the technology there, both with our accuracy on root causes, but also Cursor's accuracy on throwing in a PR? And so it's mind blowing how quickly things are accelerating, in fact. And even with when I talked to engineering execs last summer, it was all about like, hey, let's adopt AI for these very typical, say, Gen AI use cases like summarization or thinking through tasks that take a little bit of time. They're annoying. Let's eliminate those. When you think about like the build versus buy with AI, knowing how much innovation is happening, and what the perceptions of each engineers may have on those spaces, like how do you think about just AI and build versus buy and when to innovate with a vendor or alongside a vendor versus internally? And Divya, if you want to take that first, and then I'd love to hear Kent, your perspective as well.
So I actually look at it twofold. So one is innovation in the application,
Hmm.
and the process innovation, or where it's not too much of a differentiator for a given organization. In
Yep.
our team, developers own QE, ops, incident response. So I'm particularly
Hmm.
excited about AI first services as software for incident
Yeah.
response and help desk, customer support, for transforming the way we work. But when it comes to the application itself, I think true innovation lies in the diffs, diffs of
Yeah.
code, of data, of workflows. So there, I do see that the investment is important to be able to tinker with AI tools, to learn how to partner with other builders and other agents, how to be customized off-the-shelf tools. So I do think that the build muscle also needs to be nurtured along with adopting the cutting-edge third-party tools.
Yeah. Kent, what do you think? I'm curious on your perspective on building in-house AI versus going and tinkering with off the shelf or putting a strategy around it.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky, and I think we'll talk about like some of the complexities around building with AI. I think like first off, the way we started this conversation is like, how do we think about build versus buy? And I think we need to think about what problems are we solving, and then that's kind of guiding how we're adopting solutions. I kind of view AI as just a way of accelerating solving those problems in house. And so then, okay, if we look at this as an accelerator, the question is like, how much are we already invested in that space? How much competency do we have around building with AI in that space? And just even, when I think about my developer productivity group, there wasn't a huge skill set around working with AI.
Hmm.
And in the past, it might have been more math intensive. Today, it might be a little bit more approachable because you go, oh, I just need to add some text to modify a prompt, but it's actually way more complicated than that. And I think you start to realize this as you're building out tools. So I think we are really interested in seeing like, can we replace different portions of some of the things we built in the past as like one opportunity to simplify our maintenance costs.
Yeah.
And then we're also like careful of not having 1,000 different tools, as there's the proliferation of SaaS tools out in the space. And so like, where are we kind of picking and choosing where we're adopting that tooling?
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like we've seen this reemergence of hackathons. The Gabor mentioned he's like, I'm not signing with Resolve if I don't get my 20%, to hack. Um, it is fascinating in this space. There was an A16Z article yesterday. It wasn't like anything new if you've been in this space long enough around like the delta between a demo and actually taking an AI or an agent into production. Clearly, it depends on the scope of the work. Are you replacing a true workflow? Like for us, we think of like reliability. Okay, how do we approach reliability today versus what could be versus just writing a postmortem or something on a Slack thread, I'm curious from your perspective, and Divya, maybe you want to go first, is when you think about like one, enabling your engineers to do demos or create hackathons, but then also like how do you think about, okay, we want to allow our engineers to develop this muscle like Kent mentioned, but how do we know when to actually drive those into production or not?
Um, so as I shared, our team is seasoned
Yeah.
with rolling out production services, and we have been able to do it consistently with zero customer downtime. When we built the AI assistant for SQL IDE, we managed to ship that within 3 months. But this project broke all the rules because the real work actually started after we shipped. Uh,
Yeah.
we found that without any changes in code, we would see a regression. If there were new models that we needed to evaluate, that posed a challenge. How do you really come up with a benchmark for a golden data set for a user-written query, and be able to use that consistently for CI/CD and A/B testing? So with AI, that's been the challenge, that if when we're building ourselves, it's easy to come up with the prototype and the MVP, but when we start talking about production scale and the myriad use cases that people throw at it, that introduces a lot of challenges, and it's not an easy problem.
Yeah, yeah. And Kent, you had made some comments previously around that even if you have a great, say, MVP, you have to be able to give a pretty strong litmus test to know, will this be as valuable as you think it will, and what's the delta between this and in production? Like, how do you evaluate or think about these AI hackathon projects, these MVPs versus if they should be supported to go into production or not?
Yeah, I think what Divya was mentioning is pretty common too, like where you have something, and we talked about this in the past where we were describing AI as magic as well. It feels like it's magical when it does the thing that you expect it to do, especially in a hackathon setting where you're testing it against a couple of examples, everything is working great, and you're like, yes, this is, maybe it's not that hard to roll this out. And then I think reality starts hitting when you're putting it in production, or that this is the challenge, is like, if you're not doing this routinely, then there's like a bunch of steps that typical teams would do before you get into production, like you were mentioning, Josh. Like maybe you're creating your evals first, your unit tests for the prompt that you're creating, and so maybe that's step one, to validate that your agent can handle a variety of use cases. But even then, if you're going into production with millions of users, you're going to get surprised by some of the use cases there. And maybe you have constraints for your product where you don't, I mean, there's the kind of the famous thing, I don't know if it was Ford or another company, that there's customer support agent and like people asking for free
Chevy.
cars, and
Yeah.
like, oh, Chevy, okay. Yeah. And so like, there's all of these like additional risks that you may not even be thinking about because of the non-deterministic nature of how these LLMs are working. And there's a whole skill set to build around this that's not not straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like historically, a lot of it's always been functional tests, but that testing has changed so much, and even the user experience. I remember whenever I'd be talking to companies about build versus buy from a vendor side, uh, the last thing they thought about was user experience. And that's always because it's like that's not the strength that they have. And we're all developing new strengths in AI. I'm curious, like when you do put AI into production, one thing that I've seen is in meeting with, so last summer in meeting with engineering leaders, the value of, say, a GitHub Copilot, and yes, that was the leader by far at that time, was it increased the lines of code that you would write. And that's how they were measuring success. And we're like, and I like looked back and I was like, wait a second, that doesn't seem like it's very much tied to value. Today, though, now it's more around like those traditional like PLG or SAS metrics of DAOs, WOWs, MAUs, and then some qualitative like feedback, which is fascinating because how many business decisions have been made on those metrics alone? And so I'm curious, like from your standpoint, Kent, like how do you think about the ROI of AI tools or how to evaluate that you're getting the value that you're paying for?
Yeah, so I mean, this goes back to what problem am I trying to solve and how am I going to understand how that problem is being solved for me? And so yeah, I mean, I think efficiency and velocity in an organization is notoriously very hard to understand. And so I think that's sometimes where you come up with these maybe output driven metrics that might give you some sense of how things are going. But, it's, it, it might actually be doing, I mean, historically, lines of code is not a great metric. You can think about it on both sides. More lines of code, not potentially a great thing. Less lines of code, not potentially a great thing if you can't read it, if it affects readability. So yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of pitfalls with just metrics generation in general. Um, but at the end of the day, like if I'm coming to evaluate a product, I'm going to start with like the problem I'm trying to solve. And if I have a problem with, say, on call, maybe I'm just going to start with something super simple, which is, am I improving the lives of my engineers? Like, are they still waking up at 3 in the morning? Am I calling 50 engineers to wake up at 3 in the morning versus do I only have to call a couple of people? Like, how often does that have to happen? And so there's a very easy question that I can ask to all my developers is like, how do you feel about your on-call burden? You know, and that might be a good first litmus test.
Yeah.
Of course, it gets more complicated too when you're starting to figure out whether or not it's worth the spend to get there.
Yeah, definitely. And what we found too is a lot of the metrics around incidents and so forth aren't captured today. And so, yes, the value of eliminating 50 people from a bridge and taking that down to 4, as well as being able to resolve faster, clearly that's important. But if you're not measuring it today, it makes it harder to justify. I know, Divya, from your perspective, when you think about the ROI, and I would actually broaden the question. So, for leveraging AI for specific, very well-defined use cases versus larger workflows, like how do you think about the success criteria, or how do you guide your teams to be like open-minded, but also they have to put a business justification forward?
Right. Firstly, I like Ken's approach, in terms of a metric for optimizing sleep for engineers and the effectiveness of that. Um, I do agree that the first principles stay the same. But then AI also brings new dimensions in terms of evaluation. One, I'm concerned about the evaluation fatigue that engineering leaders are going to face because AI tools evolve much faster than SaaS tools, and we have to be prepared to experiment to land on what works for us. Um, and we become a prosumer for AI, so the adaptability, the security aspect of it, is going to be really important because we're going to probably purchase something and then customize it with data that we feed into this tool.
Mhm.
And does it scale with our use case? That's going to be an important factor as well. And then I know that Mayank had made a reference to this earlier, that the strategic support is also a value add. So where a company or a vendor is providing more than just the technology, would be an important factor in terms of onboarding and figuring out what would be the KPIs for success.
Yeah. Yeah, it's evolving quickly, and I think we've heard quality of life, the KPIs, and also we're helping to define those as well. I know we've only got a short amount of time left, so maybe 30 seconds each. Given that you've all been working with your teams to adopt these new skills, Divya, of course, yours is more senior and they're already doing it as well. But like, what advice would you give to a backend engineer that is looking to say evolve their understanding of AI and participate in this broadening ecosystem and developing these skills? Kent, 30 seconds. What advice would you give?
Well, I think there's a lot of tools out there nowadays. I think deeplearning.ai from Andrew Ng is a great starting point to kind of get started. I think you need to really play around with this stuff, understand foundations, and over time you'll start to see that it's pretty complex as you start working in the space.
All right, Divya.
Um, I have an overarching advice for any organization trying to dabble in AI. AI is blurring traditional roles. And with the experience that we have had in our organization, I think it's important to have an AI advisory group to share learnings and new ways of working with AI and transforming work across the organization, because I think AI is lowering the barrier to try it out. And everyone is coming at it from different angles, and it'll be really good to have everyone learn from each other within the company.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kent. Thank you, Divya, Gabor, Mayank. Great session today. Learned a lot myself, and I'd encourage you all to engage with us. Of course, we're building a big team to solve a big problem. Would love great talent to join us, but also we're going to be sharing how we're doing it along the way. And so look forward to many more sessions with you all. And thank you very much, and have a great day exploring AI.